The whispers followed Abigail Owens like shadows, clinging to her skirts as she hurried down the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878. Unworthy, they called her. Fallen woman. Beyond saving. Even the church doors seemed to close tighter when she approached, as if her very presence might taint the sanctuary within. Young widow at 22, no children. Living alone at the edge of town, in a small cabin her late husband had built before consumption took him. All this would have been enough for the good people of Redemption Creek to pity her. But pity turned to scorn when rumors spread about how she'd been seen at the saloon, not drinking, but singing for coins to pay her property taxes. A respectable woman didn't set foot in such establishments, they said. A God-fearing widow should find other means. Abigail kept her head high despite the burning in her cheeks as she passed the general store where Mrs. Henderson and her sewing circle gathered. Their conversation halted, eyes following her progress down the street. "Good day, ladies," Abigail said, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. Only one woman nodded in acknowledgement. The others pretended not to hear. At the far end of the street stood the livery stable, the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking metal ringing out from within. Abigail hesitated before approaching. She needed her mare shod, and the blacksmith charged less than the farrier 2 towns over. As she drew closer, she realized the hammering wasn't coming from the usual blacksmith, but from a stranger she'd never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered. His sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, sweat glistening on his brow, despite the coolness of the October morning. "Excuse me," Abigail called out, staying near the entrance. The man looked up, hammer poised mid-strike. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, widened slightly. He set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of an imaginary hat, as his actual one hung on a peg by the door. "What can I do for you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Peterson. Rode out to his brother's place in Tucson. Won't be back for a fortnight." The stranger stepped forward, extending his hand. "Yates Irving. I'm watching the place while he's gone." Abigail hesitated before taking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, calloused from work. "Abigail Owens," she replied, withdrawing her hand quickly. "My mare needs new shoes. Can you help with that?" Yates nodded. "I can indeed. Where is she?" "At my place. It's just past the creek, the small cabin with the red door." "I know it," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "That is, I've ridden past it. I could come by tomorrow morning if that suits." Something in his manner, the directness of his gaze perhaps, or the absence of judgment she'd grown accustomed to seeing, made Abigail linger longer than necessary. "That would be fine, Mr. Irving. I can pay." "Never doubted it, Mrs. Owens." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. As Abigail turned to leave, she heard footsteps approaching the livery. Reverend Thomas Wilcox appeared in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the packed earth floor. "Ah, Irving," the Reverend said, nodding to Yates before his gaze fell upon Abigail. His expression cooled. "Mrs. Owens." "Reverend," she acknowledged, lowering her eyes. "I trust you'll be joining us for services this Sunday? It's been some weeks since we've seen you." The undercurrent in his voice was clear. Her absence had been noted, discussed. "I've been unwell," Abigail lied. "The Lord's house is a place of healing," Reverend Wilcox replied, "for all manner of ailments." His emphasis on all made her cheeks burn anew. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, moving to leave. "Mrs. Owens," Yates called after her. "Tomorrow at 9? She nodded, grateful for the interruption, and hurried away, feeling the Reverend's disapproval like a physical weight upon her shoulders. The next morning, Abigail was up before dawn, sweeping her small porch and tidying the modest cabin. She told herself it was simply a matter of pride in her home, not because the new blacksmith was coming. She'd put on her blue calico dress, the one her mother had sewn for her, before she'd left Ohio 3 years ago to marry John Owens, a man she'd known through letters for 6 months before boarding a train west. Precisely at 9, she heard the approach of hoofbeats. Yates Irving rode a dapple-gray gelding, leading a pack horse loaded with his blacksmithing tools. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Morning, Mrs. Owens," he called, removing his hat. His dark hair curled slightly at the temples, damp with the morning's exertion. "Good morning, Mr. Irving. My mare is in the paddock around back." She led him to where her chestnut mare grazed. The horse lifted her head at their approach, ears pricked forward. "She's a beauty," Yates said, approaching slowly, letting the mare catch his scent. "What's her name?" "Penny," Abigail replied, watching as the horse nuzzled Yates's outstretched hand. "She was a wedding gift from my husband's parents." Yates worked efficiently, speaking softly to Penny as he examined her hooves. "She's been well cared for." "She's all I have left of my old life," Abigail said quietly. Yates looked up at her, something unreadable in his expression. "It can't be easy, being alone out here." "I manage," she said, stiffening slightly. He nodded, returning to his task. "I didn't mean any offense, Mrs. Owens, just an observation." As Yates worked, Abigail found herself studying him. His movements were deliberate, confident. When he spoke to Penny, his voice dropped to a gentle rumble that seemed to calm the animal immediately. "Where are you from, Mr. Irving?" she asked, passing him a tool from his kit. "All over, I suppose. Born in Kansas, raised mostly in Colorado. Been drifting the last few years." "What brings you to Redemption Creek? It's hardly on the way to anywhere." Yates paused, seeming to consider his answer. "A man gets tired of drifting eventually. Heard there might be work here." He hammered a nail into place. "What about you? You don't sound like you're from Arizona territory." "Ohio," she replied. "I came west to marry." "And your husband?" "Died last winter. Consumption." Yates nodded, not offering the usual platitudes she'd heard 100 times. "It's a hard country for a woman alone," he said instead. "So everyone reminds me," Abigail said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I didn't mean it the way the others do, just that it takes courage." Something in his straightforward manner disarmed her. For months she'd been defensive, expecting judgment from every quarter. His simple acknowledgement of her strength, rather than her vulnerability, was unexpected. By midday, Penny had 4 new shoes, and Yates was packing his tools. Abigail brought out a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. "It's the least I can offer for your work," she said, pouring him a glass. "How much do I owe you?" Yates named a price lower than what Peterson usually charged. When she started to protest, he raised a hand. "That's my rate, Mrs. Owens. Fair for the work done." As he drank his lemonade, his gaze wandered to her small garden, where late tomatoes still ripened on the vine, alongside squash and beans. "You've done well with this place," he observed. "Thank you. The soil is better here by the creek." She hesitated, then added, "I sell what I don't use at the mercantile. Or try to, anyway." Understanding crossed his features. "Town's been giving you a hard time?" Abigail looked away. "They have their opinions about what's proper for a widow." "And what do you think is proper, Mrs. Owens?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she thought in a very long time. "I think surviving is proper," she said finally. "I think working hard and maintaining my independence is proper." Yates nodded, finishing his lemonade. "I think so too." When he mounted up to leave, Abigail found herself wishing he could stay longer. There was something comforting about his presence, something she hadn't felt since John died. "Thank you for the work, Mr. Irving," she said, handing him the payment. "My pleasure, Mrs. Owens." He tipped his hat. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." As he rode away, Abigail stood watching until he disappeared around the bend. For the first time in months, she felt something other than grief or anger or resignation. It was a small, fragile feeling, barely recognizable. It felt like hope. The following Sunday, Abigail debated attending church. She'd avoided it for weeks, tired of the sidelong glances and whispered comments. But something, perhaps the memory of Yates Irving's respectful manner, gave her courage. She wore her best dress, a deep green wool that John had always admired, and pinned her honey-brown hair up beneath a modest bonnet. The walk to town took 20 minutes, and with each step, her resolve wavered. By the time the white steeple came into view, her hands were trembling. The congregation was already inside, the opening hymn floating through the open windows. Abigail paused at the bottom of the steps, gathering her courage. "Mrs. Owens." She turned to find Yates Irving approaching, dressed in a clean white shirt and dark vest. his usual work clothes exchanged for Sunday best. His hat was in his hands, his hair neatly combed. "Mr. Irving," she replied, surprised. "I didn't take you for a church-going man." A small smile played at his lips. "There's a lot you don't know about me yet." The "yet" hung between them. A promise of future conversations. "May I escort you inside?" Abigail hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Together they climbed the steps, Yates placing a gentle hand at the small of her back as they entered the church. The hymn faltered as heads turned to observe their entrance. Abigail felt her cheeks burn, but kept her chin high as Yates led her to an empty pew near the back. Throughout the service, she was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the gentle way he held the hymnal between them, the resonant tenor of his voice as he sang, the respectful attention he paid to Reverend Wilcox's sermon on forgiveness and judgment. When the collection plate came around, Yates discreetly placed several coins in it before passing it to Abigail. She added her own modest contribution, painfully aware that everyone was watching to see if the fallen widow could afford to give to the church. After the final hymn, Reverend Wilcox stood at the door, shaking hands with his congregation as they filed out. When Abigail and Yates approached, the Reverend's expression was difficult to read. "Mrs. Owens, it's good to see you back among us," he said, his tone measured. "Thank you, Reverend," she replied. "And Mr. Irving, I'm pleased to see you taking an interest in our community's spiritual welfare." There was something pointed in his comment that made Abigail uncomfortable. "Just trying to be neighborly," Yates replied evenly. "Good sermon today, Reverend, particularly the part about not casting the first stone." Reverend Wilcox's smile tightened. "Indeed, we must all strive to live by the Lord's teachings." Outside, the congregation broke into small clusters, Sunday socializing in full swing. Several people who normally ignored Abigail now nodded in her direction, their curiosity about her escort evident. "Would you allow me to walk you home, Mrs. Owens?" Yates asked, placing his hat back on his head. "I would appreciate that," she replied, aware of the eyes following them. They walked slowly, in no hurry, despite the October sun warming the day. The creek babbled alongside the path, cottonwoods rustling in the gentle breeze. "Thank you," Abigail said after they had left the town behind, "for accompanying me today. It's been difficult going alone." "I noticed you haven't been attending," Yates replied. "Figured it wasn't by choice. The welcome hasn't been warm since John died. And after I started singing at the Silver Spur to make ends meet," she broke off, realizing what she'd admitted. But Yates showed no surprise or disapproval. "You have a good voice?" The unexpected question startled a laugh from her. "Decent enough that Mr. Daniels pays me $5 a week for 3 nights' work." "That's honest work," Yates said firmly. "Nothing to be ashamed of. Try telling that to Reverend Wilcox and his flock." "Some folks confuse piety with righteousness," Yates observed. "Not the same thing at all." They reached her cabin sooner than Abigail would have liked. At the gate, she turned to him. "Would you care to stay for dinner, Mr. Irving? It's nothing fancy, just a chicken stew, but there's plenty." Something like pleasure lit his eyes. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Owens, and please, call me Yates." "Abigail," she offered in return. Inside her small cabin, Abigail felt suddenly self-conscious of the modest furnishings. A table with 3 chairs, a small sofa covered with a quilt she'd made herself, a bookshelf with the few volumes she'd brought from Ohio. The stone fireplace took up most of one wall, her bed tucked behind a colorful curtain in the corner. "It's not much," she said, removing her bonnet and hanging it on a peg by the door. "It's a home," Yates replied, his gaze taking in the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the neat stack of firewood, the carefully mended curtains. "You've made something here, Abigail." The way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. She busied herself with the stew, adding fresh cornbread and a jar of pickled beans to the table. Over dinner, Yates told her about his travels, about working cattle drives in Texas and mining claims in Colorado. He spoke of wide-open spaces and small towns, of the characters he'd met along the way. "What brought you here, really?" Abigail asked as they finished their meal. "Redemption Creek isn't exactly a place people stumble upon." Yates was silent for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I was looking for something, I suppose, a place to stop running." "Running from what?" "My past, My father's expectations. He met her gaze directly. Loneliness, maybe. The honesty of his answer touched something deep within her. Since John's death, she'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge her own crushing loneliness. I understand that, she said softly. As dusk fell, Yates helped her clear the table. Their hands brushed as she passed him a plate, and the simple contact sent warmth cascading through her. She stepped back, confused by her reaction. I should go, Yates said, seeming to sense her sudden discomfort. Thank you for dinner, Abigail. It's been a long time since I've had a home-cooked meal that good. At the door, he hesitated. Would you permit me to call on you again? The proper thing would be to say no. She was still in mourning, technically. The town already whispered about her. Being seen with Yates Irving would only add fuel to the gossip. Yes, she said anyway. I'd like that. His smile made her heart skip. Good night, then. Good night, Yates. After he left, Abigail stood at the window, watching his figure disappear into the gathering darkness. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart beneath her fingers. This was dangerous, this feeling. She'd buried one husband already. The pain had nearly broken her. She couldn't risk her heart again. And yet, as she readied for bed, she found herself humming a tune she often sang at the Silver Spur, a song about second chances and the courage to begin again. The next few weeks brought a gradual change to Abigail's life. Yates called on her regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, fresh honey from a beekeeper outside town, wildflowers gathered along the creek. They attended church together each Sunday, ignoring the whispers that followed them. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, Abigail still sang at the Silver Spur. The first time Yates appeared there, sitting quietly at a corner table, nursing a single whiskey all evening, she'd nearly forgotten the words to Barbara Allen, but his presence became a comfort rather than a distraction, a steady anchor in the smoky saloon. It was after one such evening in early November that everything changed. Abigail had just finished her last song when Tom Kendrick, a rancher known for his mean temper when drinking, grabbed her arm as she passed his table. "Sing another, pretty lady," he slurred, his fingers digging into her flesh. "I'm finished for the night, Mr. Kendrick," Abigail replied, trying to pull away. "Please let go." "Now, don't be like that." Kendrick tightened his grip. A widow woman who sings in a saloon ought to be more accommodating. Before Abigail could respond, Yates was there, his hand closing firmly around Kendrick's wrist. "The lady said she's finished," Yates said, his voice low but carrying. "I suggest you let go of her arm and apologize." The saloon went quiet, conversations halting as everyone turned to watch. Kendrick, red-faced and bleary-eyed, looked up at Yates. "This ain't your business, Irving," he growled. "I'm making it my business," Yates replied evenly. "Now let her go." For a moment, it seemed Kendrick might resist. Then, reading something in Yates's steady gaze, he released Abigail's arm. "Didn't mean no harm," he muttered. "Mrs. Owens deserves your respect," Yates said, still standing between them. "Same as any lady in this town." Kendrick looked away, properly chastised. "Sorry, Mrs. Owens." Yates offered Abigail his arm. "May I see you home?" She nodded, suddenly aware of how her hands were trembling. Mr. Daniels, the saloon owner, stepped forward to hand her the usual payment, plus an extra $1. "For the trouble," he said quietly. "You're welcome back any time, Mrs. Owens. And you too, Irving." Outside, the night air was crisp with the promise of winter. Abigail released a shaky breath, her arm still throbbing where Kendrick had grabbed her. "Are you all right?" Yates asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yes, her voice caught. "No, not really, but I will be." Without warning, Yates pulled her gently into his arms. The embrace was tentative at first, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, his arms tightened around her, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. "I'm sorry that happened," he murmured against her hair. "You don't deserve to be treated that way." Abigail allowed herself to lean into his strength, breathing in the clean scent of him, soap and leather, and something uniquely Yates. It had been so long since she'd been held, not since John fell ill, months before he died. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, "for intervening, for being there." When they finally separated, something had shifted between them. Yates's gaze lingered on her face, his eyes reflecting the silver of moonlight. "Abigail," he began, then seemed at a loss for words. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" she asked, surprising herself with the invitation. He nodded. "I would." Inside her cabin, Abigail lit the lamps and stoked the banked fire, while Yates removed his hat and coat. The domesticity of the moment wasn't lost on her, how natural it felt to have him in her home, how the small space seemed warmer, more complete with his presence. As she prepared the tea, Yates moved to her bookshelf, examining the titles. "You like poetry," he observed. "My mother taught literature before she married," Abigail explained, bringing the teapot to the table. "She believed every house needed books." "Smart woman." Yates joined her at the table. "What else did she teach you?" "To be independent, to think for myself." Abigail smiled faintly. "She wasn't very popular with the other ladies in our town." "Sounds like her daughter takes after her," Yates said, his own smile warm. "Perhaps too much," Abigail admitted. "It would be easier to just conform." Yates reached across the table to take her hand. The gesture was gentle, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "Then you wouldn't be you, and that would be a terrible shame." The simple sincerity in his voice undid her. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back spilled down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping at them with her free hand. "It's just been so hard, being alone, being judged. Some days I think it would be easier to sell everything and leave. Where would you go? Back east maybe, or California." She shrugged. "Somewhere people don't know me as that widow who sings in the saloon." Yates squeezed her hand. "And is that what you want? To leave?" Did she? The question made her pause. When John died, all she'd wanted was escape from the memories, from the pitying looks that turned to judgment when she refused to play the role of the proper grieving widow. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "This is my home. I built a life here with John. And now you're building a new life," Yates finished for her. "On your terms." The understanding in his eyes was almost her undoing. Before she could second-guess herself, Abigail leaned across the table and pressed her lips to his. Yates went still for a heartbeat, then responded with a gentleness that made her heart ache. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear as he kissed her back with exquisite care. When they parted, Abigail searched his face, wondering if she'd been too forward. But Yates was looking at her with such wonder, such tenderness, that her doubts melted away. "I've been wanting to do that since the day I met you," he confessed, his voice rough. "Really? Even knowing what people say about me? Especially knowing what they say." He took both her hands in his. "Abigail, I've never met anyone with your courage, your dignity. The way you hold your head high despite everything, it humbles me." She looked down at their joined hands. "I'm not as brave as you think. I'm terrified most of the time." "That's what courage is," Yates said. "Being afraid and standing your ground anyway." The clock on the mantel chimed 11, breaking the moment. Yates sighed, reluctantly releasing her hands. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to stand. "It's late, and people will talk." Abigail gave a small, bitter laugh. "They already talk." "All the more reason not to give them ammunition." He rose, retrieving his hat and coat. "May I call on you tomorrow?" "Please," she said, following him to the door. In the doorway, he turned to her once more. "Sleep well, Abigail." "You too, Yates." He bent to kiss her again, a gentle promise that left her breathless. Then he was gone, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night. Abigail closed the door and leaned against it, pressing a hand to her lips. For the first time in over a year, she felt truly alive. The following Wednesday brought the first significant snowfall of the season. Abigail woke to a world transformed, the familiar landscape blanketed in white. As she kindled the fire and heated water for coffee, a knock sounded at her door. Yates stood on her porch, his hat dusted with snow, a sack of provisions in one hand. "Thought you might need supplies," he explained, stomping his boots before entering. "Town's likely to be snowed in for a few days." "That was thoughtful of you," Abigail said, taking the sack. "I have coffee ready." "And fresh biscuits." They settled into a comfortable routine as the snow continued to fall throughout the day. Yates split extra firewood, while Abigail prepared a hearty stew. They ate by the fireplace, sharing stories in silence with equal ease. As dusk approached, Yates reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get back before dark. The trail gets tricky in the snow." Abigail followed him to the door, where they both hesitated. The thought of him riding through the deepening snow troubled her. "You could stay," she blurted out, then flushed at the implications. "I mean, on the sofa. It's not safe to ride in this weather." Yates studied her face for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said, more certain with each passing second. "Please stay." That night, as Yates settled on the sofa and Abigail retired behind her curtained alcove, a strange peace descended upon the cabin. The wind howled outside, snow piling against the windows. But within those walls, Abigail felt safer than she had in months. She was nearly asleep when she heard it, the soft murmur of Yates's voice. Curious, she pulled aside the curtains slightly to see him kneeling beside the sofa, hands clasped, head bowed. He was praying. The sight touched her deeply. Her own faith had been tested severely over the past year, her prayers seemingly unanswered as John wasted away, as the town turned against her. "Lord," Yates whispered, unaware of her watching, "bless this house and the woman who makes it a home. She's stronger than she knows, braver than most men I've met. The town calls her unworthy, but I see your light in her. Watch over her when I can't. Amen." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes as she let the curtain fall back into place. In that moment, something broken inside her began to heal. The snowstorm lasted 3 days. By unspoken agreement, Yates remained at the cabin, sleeping on the sofa, helping with chores, keeping the fire stoked. Each night, he knelt in prayer, and each night, Abigail listened, finding comfort in his unwavering faith. On the morning of the 4th day, the sun emerged, glittering across the pristine snow. They stood together on the porch, surveying the transformed landscape. "I should head to town," Yates said reluctantly. "Check on the livery, let folks know we're both all right." "They'll assume the worst," Abigail warned. "About us." Yates turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Let them. I know the truth, and so do you." "And what is the truth, Yates?" His eyes, blue as the winter sky above them, held hers steadily. "That I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Owens. That I have been since the moment you walked into the livery with your head high, despite what this town thinks of you." The declaration left her breathless. "Yates, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know it's soon. I know you're still healing from losing your husband. I can wait." Abigail squeezed his hands. "What if I don't want to wait? What if I'm falling in love with you too?" The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Then we face whatever comes together," he promised. As predicted, the town buzzed with gossip when they rode in together later that day. Mrs. Henderson and her sewing circle watched from the general store window, heads bent in eager conversation. Reverend Wilcox intercepted them outside the livery, his expression grave. "Mrs. Owens, Mr. Irving," he greeted them. "I'm relieved to see you both well after the storm." "Thank you, Reverend," Abigail replied, her chin high. "I must say, however, that appearances are important in a Christian community," the Reverend continued, "and the appearance of a single man staying with a widow during the storm." "With all due respect, Reverend," Yates interrupted, his tone measured but firm. "Mrs. Owens offered me shelter during dangerous weather. Would you have preferred I risk my life to preserve appearances?" "Of course not. But, and while we're discussing Christian values," Yates pressed on, "I wonder about the value of compassion. Mrs. Owens lost her husband, works honestly to keep her home, and yet faces judgment rather than support from her community." Reverend Wilcox's face reddened. "Mr. Irving, you haven't been in Redemption Creek long enough to understand our ways." "I understand right from wrong," Yates replied, "and treating a grieving widow like she's fallen beyond redemption because she sings to support herself seems wrong to me." Abigail placed a hand on Yates's arm. "It's all right," she said softly. The Reverend looked between them, something shifting in his expression. "Perhaps we have been hasty in our judgments," he conceded reluctantly. The Bible does teach us to care for widows and orphans. Yes, it does, Yates agreed, his tone softening. And it teaches us not to cast stones. Indeed, Reverend Wilcox cleared his throat. Mrs. Owens, the Ladies' Aid Society is meeting tomorrow to prepare baskets for those affected by the storm. Your presence would be welcome, should you wish to attend. It was a small olive branch, but Abigail recognized it for what it was. Thank you, Reverend. I'll consider it. As the Reverend walked away, Yates turned to her with a small smile. Progress? Perhaps, she allowed, though her heart felt lighter than it had in months. The winter deepened, and with it, Abigail and Yates's relationship. He called on her properly now, taking her to Sunday services, escorting her home from the Silver Spur on the nights she sang. Each night before leaving, he knelt beside her on the cabin floor, praying aloud for her, for them, for the journey ahead. Gradually, the town's attitude shifted. The Ladies' Aid Society, following Reverend Wilcox's lead, included Abigail in their activities. Mrs. Henderson ordered garden seeds from her. Mr. Daniels at the saloon spoke respectfully of her fine Christian gentleman caller. By Christmas, Abigail found herself invited to the community celebration at the church. She and Yates arrived together, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, her green wool dress complemented by a new shawl he'd given her as an early Christmas gift. Mrs. Owens, Reverend Wilcox greeted her at the door. Would you consider favoring us with a song? I understand from Mr. Daniels that you have quite a voice. The request, offered sincerely, brought tears to her eyes. I would be honored, Reverend. Later, as her clear soprano filled the church with Silent Night, Abigail caught Yates's gaze across the room. The pride and love shining in his eyes gave her the courage to hold the final note longer than she'd ever dared. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was genuine. Mrs. Henderson pressed her hand afterward, murmuring about the choir needing new voices. Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, praised her talent without a hint of the condescension she'd grown accustomed to. You've won them over, Yates said as they walked home beneath a canopy of stars. We have, Abigail corrected him. Your faith in me made all the difference. He stopped in the middle of the path, turning to face her. The moonlight silvered his features, catching in his eyes. Abigail, he began, then dropped to one knee in the snow. Her heart stuttered. Yates? I had a whole speech prepared, he admitted. But seeing you tonight, watching you win over the very people who judged you most harshly, it reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place. From his pocket, he withdrew a small ring, simple but beautiful, a single pearl set in silver. This was my mother's. She made me promise I'd only give it to a woman with courage and character. He took a deep breath. Abigail Owens, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing in the cold air. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes! Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was a promise, sealed beneath the vast expanse of stars. That night, for the first time, they knelt together in prayer, their joined hands a bridge between past sorrow and future joy. As Yates's deep voice asked for blessing on their union, Abigail felt the last of her doubts melt away. They married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the same church where Abigail had once felt unwelcome. Reverend Wilcox performed the ceremony, his sermon touching on themes of forgiveness, second chances, and the transformative power of love. The entire town turned out, the church packed to capacity. Mrs. Henderson had helped Abigail alter her mother's wedding dress, preserved all these years in a cedar chest. Yates wore a new suit, his eyes never leaving Abigail as she walked down the aisle toward him. Dearly beloved, Reverend Wilcox began, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the church. We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other the redemption we all seek. As Abigail and Yates exchanged vows, she thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, her grief, his wandering, the town's judgment, the prayers that had sustained them both. The pearl on her finger caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows, a reminder that beauty often comes from pain. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Wilcox declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, the community hall filled with music, laughter, and goodwill. Abigail sang for her wedding guests, a song of hope and new beginnings. Yates watched her with such love, it made her voice soar higher, stronger than ever before. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson pressed a package into Abigail's hands. "A wedding gift from the Ladies' Aid Society," she explained, "and an apology from me especially. We judged wrongly, and I'm sorry for it." Inside the package was a handmade quilt, each square contributed by a different woman from the town, including those who had once shunned her. "Thank you," Abigail said, embracing the older woman, "for giving me a second chance." "Thank your husband," Mrs. Henderson replied with a smile. "His faith in you made us see what we'd been blind to." That night, in the cabin that was now their home, Yates knelt beside their bed, as he had every night since they'd met. Only now, Abigail knelt with him, their hands intertwined, their prayers shared. "Lord," Yates began, his voice gentle in the lamplight, "thank you for this woman you've given me, for her strength and her heart. Watch over us as we build our life together." "And thank you," Abigail continued, "for sending me a man who saw worth in me when I couldn't see it in myself, who prayed beside me even when I'd lost faith in prayer." As they rose and embraced, the winter wind whistled outside, but within their small cabin was all the warmth they needed, the warmth of love reclaimed, of faith restored, of a community healed. They had been called unworthy, both of them in different ways, he for his wandering, she for her refusal to conform. But in each other, they had found a truth stronger than any judgment, that love, genuine and abiding, is the most worthy thing of all.